Good morning. Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we will be in John chapter 11, and we will hopefully finish the chapter which deals with Lazarus' resurrection. And we will pick up where Jesus has not yet arrived, but he's on his way, and Martha has gone out to meet him, and obviously when Martha has gone out to meet him, he tells her one of the 7 great I ams that you find in the book of John. I am the resurrection and the life. And we have to clearly understand that that statement is different than saying I'm responsible for the resurrection, or I'm responsible for the life. I give the resurrection, I give the life. That is not what he is saying here. What he is saying is, I am. This is who I am. I am the resurrection, and I am the life. All life that exists comes from me. And it's not a case of me giving a resurrection, and Martha didn't quite understand that. And we also know that Martha was very familiar with the scriptures, and she knew that when Jesus told her that Lazarus would rise again, she knew that in the last day he would rise, and obviously she didn't realize that he would rise very soon. So Martha comes back into town and sees her sister Mary and tells Mary about it. And Mary, in verse 31, and verse 30 rather, now Jesus was not yet come into town, but was in the place where Martha met him, and the Jews then who were with her in the house and confronted her, when they saw Mary, the other sister, she rose up and hastily went out, following her, saying, she goes to the grave to weep. Now they assumed that Mary was going to go to the grave to weep, which was part of the Jewish tradition. Then when Mary was come and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Now we're going to see that mentality here, and we're going to see it a little further on. And you need to keep that in mind. She understood that. She understood the power of healing because she had seen Jesus do a lot of healing. And when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping who came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Now we're going to see that groaning and that being troubled in the spirit manifests itself in a very different way, I think, than people understand in verse 38. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. And you will notice the very next phrase, Jesus wept. Now, that is for practical purposes, that is the shortest verse in the Bible. But many people extract from that all sorts of things. They say the reason he wept was because of sin, the reason he wept was, and they come up with all kinds of reasons that he wept. Now we have to understand that there was a great bond, human bond, between the family of Lazarus and his sister Mary and Martha and Jesus. And we have seen that, and I've talked about that love that he had, that human love he had for those people. It was a great, deep affection. And therefore, I think it was because of this that he wept. Now, when it's weeping for sin, that comes later. And we'll see that. And Jesus, then the Jews said, behold how he loved him. And they could see the expression, and this is part of the humanity of Christ. And obviously the people understood this great human love that Jesus had for Lazarus. And some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Now that is not a question of his power. They had seen Jesus heal the blind man. And they were saying, well, he healed all these sick and he healed this blind man. Certainly he could have kept Lazarus from dying. That is not what they're saying. What they are addressing here, and it's kind of implied, it's underlying, is this. Who was the blind man to Jesus? And who is Lazarus to Jesus? Now you have to go back to the emotions that you see, such as the weeping. There was no weeping when it came to healing the blind man. Why not? Because the blind man was a stranger. He was a stranger to the Jesus, or the humanity of Jesus. And so Jesus healed him. But this man who's dead, this is Lazarus, this is his friend. This is his deeply beloved friend. And now they're saying this, certainly, this is what they're implying, certainly, if he could heal the blind man, who is a stranger, there's no reason why he didn't come and heal Lazarus. And therefore, they are questioning that relationship. Certainly, he loved him, did he? Did he really love him? Because if he had, he would have healed him far quicker than he would have the blind man. And this is basically what they're talking. They're not talking about his ability to heal the sick. They've seen so much of it. So they believe in that, but they're dealing with the relationship here. And then it says this, Jesus, therefore, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone laid upon it. Now, let's stop for a moment. He groaned within himself. I don't know how to describe this. I'm going to describe it by showing two extremes, and you'll understand it. How many of you have seen a person laugh so hard that they actually snort? You ever hear that? I'm sure many of you have. I think we all have. We all have heard people laugh so hard, etc., that they actually snort. And I have seen people laugh while they are drinking, etc., and they spit out their drink and that sort of thing. That is one extreme of the spectrum. Now that's the happy or the funny side. That's the happy side. Go to the sad side, and have the sadness be so great that there's actually a snort. Actually, I don't know what else to call it, a shudder, something that doesn't seem to fit the sobbing and the crying. It just kind of doesn't belong there. And that is what's going on here, and that's what Jesus did. Here, I think this is his response to sin. And he sees the sin in them questioning his relationships. He sees that. Even in the midst of this tragedy, what are they doing? They're questioning the relationship of Jesus to Lazarus. In other words, they're not concerned about him doing something, whatever it is. They didn't know he was going to raise him from the dead, but whatever it is. But it was an attack. And therefore he groans. Sin can cover itself very well and disguise itself. And this this is why he groaned within himself. This is why you see this snort sort of thing. Then 39 says this, Jesus said, take away the stone. Now the stone was put there for a number of reasons. In those days, you buried the dead the same day that he died because of the heat and because they didn't embalm and they didn't finish. There was a lot of grave robbing. There was the rotting occurred real quick, and the smell was horrendous in about 3 or 4 days, and the decaying of the body. So they put a stone there to keep away the grave robbers, to keep away people, and to keep the stench in. So there was a stone in front. He says, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, said unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he has been dead 4 days. And certainly if you looked at the body in those days, etc., the ooze would be coming out of him, the body would be bloated, it would be tremendous stench, very foul stench, and therefore it was nothing to, there's no point in opening this door. Then he said unto her, said I not unto thee, that if thou wouldst believe, thou shouldst see the glory of God? He said, and he looked at her and he says, didn't I tell you that Lazarus would rise, basically? And she had said, yes, on the last day. But he said, do you believe me? And she had said, yes, I believe you. I believe that you are the Lord, you are the Christ. And obviously here he's telling her, he's questioning her faith. Didn't I tell you? And then you say this, then they took away the stone from the place where the dead were laid, and most stones were round, so they could roll them into place, roll them out of place. And Jesus lifted up his eyes. Now I want you to notice what he's saying here to the Father. Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. Now he knew the Father always hears him. See, he says that. And I knew that thou hearest me always. He knows that. Therefore, he has to be saying that for other reasons. But because of the people who stand by, I said it, that they might believe that thou hast sent me. Now that is an explanation of why you see the snort back in verse 38. You see, in other words, there has to be something there for him to address loud, etc., so that the people will understand what's going on. And therefore he speaks to God the Father, and he wants them to know that he said that they might believe that thou hast sent me. In other words, he wants them to know that he is the Messiah. And if they come to the conclusion that he is the Messiah before he raises Lazarus, then all the things that Isaiah says and Jeremiah and Ezekiel said about the Messiah would come back to mind, and they would realize that he has the power to raise the dead. So he says to them that he's connected to the Father and that he is the Messiah. So now he has addressed himself to them, and he has basically said to them that he is God. I want them to believe that I am God. And I want them to, basically, Martha, you're going to see my glory. You're going to see the glory of God. And when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. That's a poor rendition. A loud voice, I think there's a double statement here. It's almost like, and he cried loud with a loud voice. I think that's probably a good rendering. I think that's a good rendering. He cried loud with a loud voice. In other words, this man was used to talking to a huge crowd, etc., and he had a booming voice. And this is the top of his voice. He yells as loud as he can. And he has to address Lazarus. He has to use Lazarus' name. By using Lazarus' name, he not only narrows the power of raising the dead, but he eliminates all the others from rising from the dead. If he had said, come forth, and that's all he had said, can you imagine the number of people that would come out of the ground? That's the power of God here. Instead, he identifies one, names one. He says, Lazarus, come forth. And everyone heard it. And guess what happens? And he that was dead came forth. I'm going to read that again. And he that was dead came forth. Is there something missing here? This is so matter-of-factly. To me, there ought to have been whistles and fireworks and earthquakes and pounding of the drums and cheering and all sorts of things. The sun should have gone blinking, back and forth, anything to announce the first time in history that a dead man came back to life. No. What does it say? And he that was dead came forth. That was it. I don't know, maybe I'm missing the boat here. Maybe I want something that is greater than, I had a great expectation here and it's just not here. And I think you have to look at Jesus' statement and John looking at Jesus. There's no big thing here to God. To man, we want the whistles and we want the bells and we want the earthquakes and we want the whole of creation shouting a cheer. But to God, raising the dead is no harder than creating a sun that is creating a universe. He speaks, it's done. And therefore, what you see here is that the actions of the first title mentioned in John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. And here the Word stands. And the Word speaks. And whatever comes out of the mouth of that Word occurs. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was standing outside of Lazarus' grave, and the Word ordered Lazarus to come forth, and Lazarus came forth. And he didn't come forth smelling bad. He came forth absolutely whole in a new body. And it says this, he came forth bound hand and foot, which is typical of what they used to do. They used to wrap cloth and swaddling clothing. Same thing Christ was buried in, or was rather at birth was wrapped in. They wrapped the bodies around the legs and around the limbs and around the torso, and as they wrapped, they dropped spices inside it to trap the spices, and that's how the body was wrapped, and then it's put away. He says, and grave clothes, and this would be in the swaddling clothes. And his face was bound with cloth. And Jesus said unto them, loose him, and let him go. He orders the men to loose him and let him go, unbound him. But here's the amazing thing. What put Lazarus in the grave? You can say the sickness. You can say whatever you'd like, but I'm going to tell you what will put him in the grave. It was sin. Sin put Lazarus in the grave, because sin, the product of sin, are diseases and things, sicknesses and decay and death. And that's what it says in Romans 3:23, right? The wages of sin is death, and Lazarus experienced that death, and therefore he experienced the wage of that sin. So sin put him in. And you can say, loose him and let him go. And literally, Jesus unbound him from that sin. And that is why, by unbounding him from that sin, that is why Lazarus could come forth. Now, the other thing you see here is you see an interplay between the words of God and the responsibility of man. The sovereignty of God, sovereign in raising Lazarus from the dead, and the responsibility of man. In our salvation, we have both. We have the sovereignty of God in choosing us to be saved, and then we have the responsibility of man to respond to that choice. And therefore, both of that is seen here. And then you'll see this. This is wonderful. Then many of the Jews who came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. First reaction, they believed on Jesus because of what they saw. So those people who were there, many of them, it doesn't say all of them, it says, then many of the Jews who came to Mary, many of them got saved, but not all of them. Isn't that amazing? You see a man rise from the dead and not everybody believes. In verse 46 you say then, but some of them went their way to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees and the council and said, what are we doing? What do we? For this man does many miracles. Now they come out and come right out and say the word miracles. In other words, what is a miracle? It is a miracle that only God can do. What are they doing? In their blindness, they're admitting that Jesus can do miracles. In other words, Jesus can do something only God can do. And now they're afraid. Now you're going to see what their motive is behind attacking Jesus. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and the nations. In other words, people will move to Jesus, and the Romans don't have anything to do with Jesus other than he's a Jew. And therefore, he will not need the ruling class anymore. They'll go and they'll deal with Jesus. So they're worried about their position. I have seen this in a roundabout way. I had a girl in my class who was a Muslim, who was from Afghanistan, and she would not. And she came right out and told us she would not accept Jesus Christ as her Savior because if she did and she went home, she would be killed. Not too much different than what these people, in other words, she was concerned for her own safety. They were concerned for their own position, political position. Not much different. They were afraid of something. But this is made up. This is made up. There is no, the Romans aren't going to meet with Jesus. They're just making up an excuse for what they're going to do. And one of them named Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, said unto him, you know nothing at all. Now let's go to Caiaphas. Who in the world is Caiaphas? Caiaphas is a high priest. And why does it say being the high priest that same year? Because it had come to the point, the high priest was positioned until he died. But this one was elected just for 1 year, or for at least for this year. And this was the Roman appointment. In other words, they appointed a man, and they put a man as high priest so that they could control the Jewish religion. And therefore, Caiaphas was a puppet of Rome. So he said, you know nothing at all, nor consider that this is expedient for us that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation perish not. Now, he doesn't realize it, but he is making a very, very profound prophetic statement. Out of his mouth comes the truth. The only thing is, he's thinking on a physical level, and Jesus, he's not thinking on a spiritual level. On a spiritual level, one must die to save the whole nation. Then he goes further. And this spoke he not of himself, but being a high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for that nation. And Jesus did die about 1 week later. And then he says this, and not for the nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that are scattered abroad. Now, that includes you and I. So out of his mouth comes a tremendous prophetic statement, and that is not new to God. God has used many times, he has used foreigners. Nebuchadnezzar is a good example. A pagan, giving prophecy to a pagan, etc. A donkey, giving prophecy. Then from that day forth, they took counsel together to put him to death. In other words, the plan to put him to death was not instituted yet. The decision to put him to death was. Now the reason the plan wasn't started yet was because Jesus and his apostles had not arrived in Jerusalem. Therefore, Judas, who is part of the plan here, has not arrived there for them to make that move. But the decision to kill Christ is already made before the week of the Passover. And Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went from there onto the country near to the wilderness, onto the city of Ephraim, called Ephraim rather, and there continued with his disciples. If you look here, there's Jerusalem here. He went up here to this country of Ephraim. He went about 10 miles north, which would have been right in here someplace. There's a city there. And that's where he went. And he stayed there for a little while because he's about a week and a half away from the crucifixion. And it says the Jews' Passover was near at hand, and many went out of the country onto Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Okay, now they're coming up to the Passover, as good Jews would do. Then sought they for Jesus and spoke unto themselves that he stood in the temple. And remember, you must remember that in the past 2 Passovers, the central figure was Jesus, and how he cleansed the temple and how he battled with the Pharisees, etc. So now they're waiting for him again. What think ye that he will not come to the feast? In other words, they were questioning whether or not. So they were looking for him. They were looking for him to be there. Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment that if any man knew where he were, he would show it, that they might take him. So the word was out that the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and the religious people were looking for Jesus. And the people were looking for him also. And Jesus was using the fact that the people were looking for him and the fact that he had gone to the other 2 Passovers and made himself known, and they were hoping to capture him. And he will arrive to the Passover. He will arrive. And how he arrives in Jerusalem and how he makes himself known is already predicted. It is already predicted in the Old Testament. Now, if they had even considered for 1 minute that he was the Messiah, they would know the scriptures, and they would know that their Messiah would come riding into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. They would know that. And that is not too many days apart. So the hostility of the Jewish religious people are going to come to full fruition. But what is really sad is he has raised a dead man. He has raised him back to life. He has demonstrated that he is not only the authority over diseases and sin and demons, but he is the authority over the greatest of all enemies, death. And they will not buy it. Blindness, willful blindness, cannot see anything but itself. And they're only concerned about their well-being and remaining in power. So next week we will see the beginning of Jesus' ministry to his apostles, and we will be on the road eventually to the crucifixion. So until next week, I bid you Godspeed from On Victory's Side. See you next week.